Thank you, Brenda. So this is the second in our autumn series for the Devon Cole Record Society. And we have another one starting up again, of course, in January, which is going to be slightly different. The next ones are after this, are 4th of December and 11th of December, but we'll come back to that afterwards. This afternoon, we are very fortunate, and this has been something I've been looking forward to for some time, to have Paul Cockerham talk us about Cornish monuments. Now, Paul did his PhD in 2003. It was published in 2006. There is a copy for sale on Amazon, and I have to admit, a staggering price. I think it's £110, and I'm sure it's worth every penny. His PhD was on Cornish monuments, 1497 to 1660. He spent 40 years in Cornwall working on Cornish monuments and memorials, but he had been interested in this, he tells me, since he was 16. But he is known in his publications for being much wider, and you will know him, there we go for another, for publishing on the continent. He is publishing with us in a year's time on Glynn's notes on Cornish parish churches, which is not quite a companion volume for our volume this year, but it's an echo of it. Similar type of material, but done, I think, in a very different way. It's got a different tone altogether. So I'm going to hand over to Paul. We can have questions afterwards, either through chat or directly. You can ask when you unmute yourself. I'm going to over. I'm going to make Paul a co-host. So he now has the power to turn on and share his screen. So thank you very much, Paul, for staying with us and giving us what I'm sure is going to be a great talk.
Good. I think we've got there. Has everybody that is unmuted, can they see the title page there, Cornish Tomb Monuments? Yep, good. Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Todd. I wanted to speak to you this afternoon on Cornish Tomb Monuments. Now, rather than just giving you a quick Cook's tour around the county from 1100 to 1700, which is a nice occupation for a Saturday afternoon, I thought I'd try and put in a little bit of meaning to them by tying them into a kind of materiality. And there is a contrast here, so before and after the Reformation. There are some quite sort of distinct differences here. And by the way, yes, I'm surprised to see my thesis published at 100 and whatever it is pounds. If anybody really does want a copy of it, I can send them a PDF of the entire thing free of charge. It also has the advantage of being indexable, which the published version doesn't. But just for your information. Anyway, let's kick off. This is a hogback tomb of the 11th century at St. Tudy. Notice at once that it's made of granite, and notice as well the crudity of the interlaced carving on the top and the blind arcading on the side. And it's typical, if you like, of the intractability of granite. Granite, as I'm sure we all know, is a pretty tough, hard stone. It isn't easily carvable. It is monumental in its appearance. And this stone, which was presumably dragged pretty much off the moor into the parish, automatically gives you an impression of massiveness, of status, of social importance of whoever would have been commemorated by this, whether it was in the churchyard or whether it was in the parish church. I think either is a possibility. But whoever it was obviously somebody of importance in the parish and wanted to be commemorated by something that people would recognise and remember. Moving on, we have the famous tombstone of Clarisse de Bollet at St. Buryan, which is probably 13th century. And here you've got the start of some religious symbolism. You've got a cross fleury on a stepped Calvary, And most importantly, you've got an inscription as well, written in Norman French. Clarisse, la femme Geoffrey de Bollet, dit ici, Dieu de l'âme et merci, que pour l'âme funt dior dit ouillot de pardon averant, or Aron, as the normal French would be nowadays. So Clarisse, the wife of Geoffrey de Bollet, lies here. God of her soul have mercy. Those who pray for her soul shall have 10 days pardon, 10 jours de pardon. So we've got an inscription, we've got a name, we've got status, we've got an intercessory request, we've got the grant of an indulgence to somebody that wants to pray for them. And so you've got a monument now that is starting to communicate something to an audience. There is starting to get a meaning to these things. It's a granite again, so again the carving is relatively what should we say, tentative. There's a little bit more refinement than the hogback tomb, but as you can see, it's a pleasing monument, coffin-shaped slab, but it doesn't actually show you very much, although it is just on the cusp of starting to do so, starting to communicate to whoever's there. Now, moving on again into the early 14th century, at St. Morgan in Monigue, here we've got the effigy of a knight of the Carmano family and his wife. Now, these effigies, as you can see, are effigies, in other words, they are figures of the commemorated. Secondly, they're sculpted in full relief, and they are of freestone. And most likely they were covered with gesso, which is a kind of plaster-based material on which fine, refined carving could be done much, much more easily than in stone. And they were then painted. So if you like, the materiality of this tomb wasn't terrifically important because it was painted, there was gesso covering it, and so what lay underneath as the stone, if you like, provided the foundation of the sculptures and the effigies, but it wasn't necessarily what the audience actually saw. These figures are in a tomb niche in the transept wall. Again, you've got their physical appearance. It's important. There's a knight in the act of drawing his sword. He's got his shield with the bend of the arms of Carmano, so noting his family, his illustrious lineage and so on. And it's, if you like, going a little bit back to the aesthetics of the hogback tomb of size, impressiveness, and this kind of authoritarian aspect of commemoration that these commemorated wanted actually to convey. And continuing that theme, at Cheviot, we've got two effigies, Sir Edward Courtenay and his wife Emmeline, both around the 1370s. And you can see at once that these are two life-size freestone figures. They're set in a transeptal extension of beerstone under this kind of ribbed coving, a blank arcading sort of ceiling almost, under which they rest. But as you can see, particularly on the lady's headdress, here, you've got polychromy, you've got evidence of the colouring that was actually coating these effigies. And so again, the materiality of these effigies didn't really matter, although obviously the beerstone in which they were set was part of the structure of the church. So again, you've got this impression of power, status, but now you've got one, if you like, of importance to the church, because these figures were set into the church fabric themselves. So materially, if you like, they were part of the ecclesia. But as I say, the actual material of the effigies underneath the paint wasn't important. It's what they were showing, the finery of the costumes, the delineation of them, the sculpture of the armed figure, the fact that he was an armed figure, you know, this majestic authoritarian kind of appearance was the business. However, not always, because here we've got a monumental brass in the Church of Cardinham, right up there on the top of Bodmin Moor, to a priest called Thomas Ormall, who was replaced in his parish around about 1400, 1401, when presumably he died. And this is a brass set in a slab of Purbeck marble. And this is a grave marker set directly into the church floor, marking his grave in the chancel, his chancel, basically. He was a rector, so he had charge of his own building there. And there is automatically, if you like, moving away from this authoritarianism of the monument to a humbleness. People walked on his grave, walked on this brass, you know, and it was pragmatic. because it was set in the church floor, and therefore it wasn't stuck up in the middle of the chancel as a great tomb that people had to walk round and so on. Nowadays, brasses aren't terrifically that impressive to look at, but imagine it as the finished product of the workshop, and imagine that figure and the inscription gilded and set into a sort of shining stone Purbeck slab. And it imparts a totally different visual aesthetic to what we find nowadays. Imagine the two shields below, as well as being coloured in the tinctures of the Albemarle or Albemarle coat. This was London work. This was brass imported from the continent. It was mined in the Harz Mountains in Germany, imported probably via the Flanders connection, the Hanse and so on, into London. And Purbeck marble was obviously transported south from the Isle of Purbeck into London. The whole thing's put together by the London marblers, and then the brass set in its Purbeck slab was sent down the coast again to be laid down in Cardamom Church. Now, as I say, he's only a priest, but he was a scion of the Albemarle family, this knightly rich family of Devon, and so he wanted a tomb to display himself, commemorate himself with the heraldry, recognizing his lineage connectivity, and that's what he got. Now, only a few miles away, over the top of the moor at Blisland, you have this slab of John Balsam, who died in 1410. Again, his contemporary, if you like, of Albemarle, London work, brass plate set in Purbeck marble, and again laid down in the middle of his chancel. And curiously as well, at Warleggan Church, again in the moor, you have an almost identical effigy of a priest of the same sort of date. The brass has gone, but you've still got the Purbeck slab with the indent there. So rather curiously, you've got this sort of little cluster of slabs to these priests right up in the middle of the remoteness of Bodmin Moor, all from London. These guys had the ability to order these things, had the connections to order these things from London. Moving on, at Lanteglas by Foy, we have this splendid tomb recess in the South Chapel, which is probably a chantry chapel for the Moon family. And as you can see, it is set into a recess with a multi-cusped arch. There is a tomb chest front with 8 shields. There are 2 more shields at the top corners, and a massive opportunity, if you like, for heraldic display and to discourse the lineage kinship of these sorts of people. The tomb chest seems to be of bare stone. On the back, there is a painting which I think is of the resurrection, Christ stepping out of the coffin. You can just see there the rectangular nature of the coffin, but it is a very, very faded kind of topic. And on top of the tomb chest, you have this brass, again, London work, set in Purbeck marble, and again of a figure in armour, with moon heraldry on the brass on the tomb chest front. And again, you've got this physical integration of these monuments, just like you had at Cheviot and at St Morgan to a certain extent, physical integration into the church fabric. Now, curiously as well, this wasn't an individual commemoration. It was a generic or a referential monument. In other words, it was a monument to which members of the family made reference, because it had an ancestral commemorative meaning as well. The inscription reads, Hic jacent, plural, here lie, Thomas de Moon, ac Johannes pater eius, filius et heres Reginaldi de Mohun militis. So here lie Thomas de Moon and John, his father, who was son and heir of Reginald de Mohun, knight. So they're getting in the knightly reference. This was a knightly family. This was people who were stressing their street cred in the social hierarchy of such things. And they did this by having 2 prestigious people buried there, but marking the grave just with a tomb, but with one single representative effigy. So again, you've got a mix of materials. You've got paint, you've got Purbeck marble, you've got brass, you've got freestone. There's a whole melange, if you like, of materiality here. And continuing that theme, at Dulo, we have the tomb of Sir John Causal, who died in 1483. And this was, if you like, a bit of an extension of the chantry chapel that you've got at Llanteglos into an all whistles and bells chantry chapel. It's got everything. Here you have this tomb monument. It is an effigy in limestone, but it is very likely that although limestone, it was actually made up in the Midlands, because or by a Midlands carver anyway, because the details of the armed figure are almost exactly like those of alabaster figures churned out by the alabasterers in Burton-on-Trent, where not far from the alabaster quarries. And so there is this sort of stylistic resemblance there. So that effigy lies on another slab of Purbeck marble. I don't think this one went up to London. I think it came directly from Purbeck to Doulo, or to wherever the workshop was. And again, it's set on a freestone tomb, the sides of which have quatrefoils with a shield in the middle of each. On the head of the tomb, there is a scene of the crucifixion. And again, it is now set in the middle of the chantry chapel, but originally it was set under the arcade, so that it was set under the arch between the choir of the church, the chancel of the church, and the chantry chapel. And it was set so that the figure, Sir John, was looking up at this corbel, this angel acting as a corbel to the arch springing up between the, as I say, the chancel and the side chapel. Now, this angel has a shield. It would have been of his arms. And so you've got this integration of him, his arms, his representation as the angel, if you like, was taking him and prayers for his soul and his soul itself up to heaven in the form of his personal insignia as regards the heraldry. Now, the angel is of beerstone. There is more beerstone carving in the arcades of the chapel. Just look at the beauty of the skill of this carving. It's absolutely superb. When you walk into this church, it's really the last thing that you think of seeing. And I know I probably shouldn't say this, but actually there's quite a lot of green mold on it in the recesses of the sculpture. And in fact, the green mold shows the relief carving off to quite a nice degree. So I think it's something that if it ever is conserved, it would be nice actually to retain some degree of mold as a degree of verisimilitude. Probably shouldn't say that, but I just have, and it's been recorded as well. Hey ho. This is a wooden screen. Most of it is original, again between the chancel and the chantry chapel. So we've got a great multitude again of materials involved in commemoration of this one very, very rich, very, very powerful individual. Now here is an alabaster figure, most likely done up in the Midlands, and this is to Sir Robert Willoughby, 1502 at Callington. And again, like the Doulo figure, it is set under the arch between chancel and North Chapel. And so again, you're getting all this kind of, just like those three-piece priests up in Bodmin Moor, all chose of brass. Then here we have a Cornish aristocrat commissioning a tomb of very much the same kind of style and type as another Cornish aristocrat at Doulo. So there is a degree of conservatism here in personal choice. So that's a quick canter through some initial monuments and so on. And I think it's time now to sort of just gather up a few thoughts. And hopefully I've stressed the fact that materiality wasn't really a crucial aspect to commissioning a monument. It was more the appearance of the thing that they were concerned about. As I say, these priests, think of this gilded brass, glistening, set in this polished Purbeck slab and so on. You know, it would have been quite a magnificent sight that we just don't see today. But more to the point was connectivity. Connectivity was key in ordering these monuments because they were mostly made out of county. London for brasses, Burton-on-Trent for alabaster or the Doulo effigy, Exeter, Beerstone, etc., etc. So ordering involved cosmopolitanism. It involved out-of-county contacts. And with that in mind, the patronage was obviously restricted to relatively well-to-do and well-connected families, who were obviously all related to each other down in this neck of the woods. So you've got the Moons, the Carmenos, the Arundels, the St Albans, Causal, Willoughby, all people moving in the greater gentry and aristocratic circles. So materiality tended to be at this point a secondary concern, and conservatism, or same old in monumental patronage, was in fact a very strong influencer. Hence we've got, as I say, the brasses in Bodmin Moor, tomb effigies at Doulo and Callington, brasses at Crowan, and so on and so on and so on. And yet, this is a probable shrine of Centendelium, Centendelianus, probably, sorry, at Centendelium, and it is by somebody who Pevsner christened the Master of Centendelium. But it's now thought much more likely that this was a product of a workshop which had intermittent production of sculptured artifacts throughout the 15th century, but restricted to the use of Catacluse stone, which was quarried from the Catacluse Point, which is not far away from Padstow. Now, the dating of these things is very difficult because these depressed four-centered arches, although they're suggestive of the late 15th century, actually there could be a much wider chronological range. But it is a beautiful, beautiful structure, immensely tactile. If you've been to Centendelium, or you have the opportunity to go there, go and have a look at this thing, touch it, kneel in these niches and so on, as people used to do to get themselves closer to the saints' relics inside. But the quality of the carving is second to none, and it is a superbly beautiful artifact, and specially manufactured, if you like, as a saint's shrine. So not strictly speaking commemorative, but certainly cast in the same sort of ilk. This is a poorer photo of a shrine, probably at a probable shrine at St. Issy. Again, you've got these depressed four-centered arches. You've got groining in the underneath them. Shafts again around the sort of niche there, just accommodating space. Again, a beautiful piece of work. This is one possibly at Hartland, a possible shrine of the late 15th century. You can see the tracery of the window there, which looks sort of late, very late perpendicular. The shield set in this melange of roundels, quatrefoils, etc., etc., etc. And last but not least, we have the famous tomb to Prior Thomas Vivian, died 1533 at Bodmin. And harping this sort of theme of materiality, this was also of Catacluse. Now, Vivian would have had the contacts, he would have had the connectivity, he'd have had the resources to have been commemorated by a tomb of anything he liked, basically, and whatever workmanship he wanted, whether he wanted a brass, an alabaster tomb, nothing at all, cross slab, whatever, doesn't matter. He decided on a Catacluse tomb with his effigy on top. So a little bit like the Willoughby tomb at Callington and Causal at Doulo, and yet it was of Catacluse. So possibly one Cornelius Harman was the sculptor, and it's thought that he made tombs at Lea Marney in Essex to the first and second Lords Marney, which incorporate terracotta, a lot of Renaissance influence there, Renaissance detailing of these tombs. And the effigies there are also of Catacluse. And you think, well, Lea Marney, Catacluse in Cornwall, what's the connection? Well, just remember that there is a prebendary Marney in Centendelium, and the Marneys, these Lords Marney, actually owned land in and around where the quarry was. So there is a distinct possibility of them ordering stone for their tomb effigies from this remote Cornish quarry. Ordering in a Renaissance-inspired sculptor from the continent, Cornelius Harman, and then Vivian just sort of clicked his fingers and ordered the same kind of thing for himself. And yet in Catacluse, and that's puzzled me always to a certain extent. And again, you've got this beautiful sort of Renaissance spiral detailing around these pilasters. You've got the symbols of the evangelists in these wreaths. There's one, there's another. You've got heraldry set within wreaths. There's the heraldry of Henry VIII He'd have been well chuffed to know that his arms were on the tomb of Prior Vivian before he dissolved the priory. So what I'm harping at, if you like, is there an element of sanctity here using this stone? As I said, we've used it in saint shrines at St. Issy and at Centendelium. It would be nice if we knew the material of the shrine at St. Petroc. Could that also have been cataclysm? And so we're getting a kind of resonance of sanctity of Vivian wanting himself to be associated with these sacred artifacts, because he put himself up there as the important prior that he was. Extending that slightly, we've got some tomb slabs. This is John Vivian at Bodmin, 1545. We've got Thomas Collins, last prior of Tywardreath, 1534. John Ruscarrock at Centendelium, 1527. And we've got a stoop at Centendelium. Now, a stoop obviously has holy water in it, so again, there's an element of sanctity there. We've got 3 cross slabs. Cross, the ultimate Christian symbol. All of, if they're not cataclysm, they're in dark slate lookalike cataclysm, so the same kind of imagery, if you like, being projected. So are these more instances of people wanting to sort of piggyback on the sanctity of this actual material of cataclysm? And remember again, we've got fonts at Padstow and St. Merrin. Again, we've got the sanctity of sacrament of baptism here. Okay, it's possible, probable if you like, that cataclysm was selected for these artifacts because of its inherent sculptural workability. But if that was the case, and you've got this cataclysm workshop functioning on during the 15th century, why weren't there more tombs made of it? Why was Vivian's the only one that we know of? Was he the only kind of ecclesiastical grandee that, if you like, set himself up as the degree of ecclesiastical high upness, if you like, that he would be able to discourse that kind of sanctity on himself? I'm flying a kite here. I'm sure Jo Mattingly thinks I am, but I'd be very welcome for her views. But hey, you know, it's a thought, isn't it? And more importantly, if we go across the channel to Lochrannon in Finisterre, we have the tomb monument of St. Ronan, which is mid-15th century. Now, this wasn't sculpted in cataclysm. It was made of Chrysanthemum stone, which was quarried on the north coast of Brittany. But sculpturally, it is almost as receptive to fine carving as cataclysm. And again, it matures to a similar finish, and it, again, like cataclysm, it is beautifully, beautifully tactile. You've just really got to go up and touch these things, run your fingers over the smoothness of the surface, and they are an absolute delight. Now, chrysanthemum was also used in the mid to late 16th century for much sculpture in the enclos paroissial, in other words, in the churchyard, where the Breton technique, if you like, was for moving out of the church into the churchyard, particularly for burials. They erected ossuaries and all sorts of things. And so they erected lantern crosses there, just like, if you like, the lantern crosses, guess what, of cataclysm in Cornwall. So you get what I'm saying. Is there a degree of sanctity using this particular material? Now, moving on, post-Reformation to the slate slabs of Cornwall. Now, for a start, obviously, this used native Cornish material. Slate is indigenous to the county. Obviously, there's a very famous quarry at Delabole and St. Neots. There are others around the place and so on. So it is an easily obtainable material. And this was generally patronized, if you like, by the middling sort. People who, prior to the Reformation, probably wouldn't have had either the connections to commission a monument from out of county, and so they've now got the opportunity to use local materials for their own use, local materials for material memorialization that was not available to them pre-Reformation. And so here we've got this early example of a single dominant figure to Anne Smith, again at Dulo. And to use the words of Sir Roy Strong when he was describing 16th century portraits, he always used to call them as being in gorgeous gem encrusted costumes. And this is exactly what we've got here. Look at the beautiful embroidery on her dress, the ruff round her neck, her little hat, her tiny little hands. They're a bit Trump-like, really, aren't they? With gloves, one holding gloves and the other holding her book. So there's a neatness there, but hey, look at this gown, open in front to show her dresses underneath. And there she was in all her finery. She really was in her Sunday best on her gravestone. This is how she wanted to be portrayed. And obviously slate has a wonderful degree of carvability, if you like. It's a soft stone. So these sorts of things were relatively easy to carve. And the techniques were probably kind of appropriated from those used by plasterworkers and so on in mouldings and similar kind of embellishments that you've got here. Now the motivation had changed as well post-Reformation, because suddenly purgatory didn't exist anymore. No intercession happened. Your soul just went up to heaven if you were any good, or to hell if you weren't. And so the function was to discourse much more the social status in the parish of the commemorated, broadcast any kinship, any lineage affiliations and so on, but also, again, going back to this question of authority, to actually stress the fact that these people were in the parish. Because post-Reformation and post the confusion of the land market after the dissolution and the Reformation and Edward VI and then William and Mary and then Elizabeth, it must have been quite a roller coaster of the times. The land market was fluid, and so some estates were crumbling away as others were buying up land. And of course, of these sort of new get-rich-quick people, then they wanted to make sure that they were recognised, newly recognised, the nouveau riche, if you like. They wanted some kind of status symbol. And so they erected these things in Cornish churches and so on, using Cornish sculptures and, as I say, using Cornish materials. Going on, this is a tomb chest, quite a famous tomb chest of Thomas Vincent, who died in 1606, and his wife Jane and family. It's in North Hill Church in, again, to the east of Bodmin Moor. Now, Vincent was a lawyer, and despite the fact that the front of the tomb quite obviously broadcast 3 shields, he had no official armigerous status. I mean, why should he? He wasn't one of the landed gentry, he was a professional. And yet he was using a tomb here to, if you like, struggle up to the social status of the landed gentry, and putting on Vincent heraldry, which was actually taken from the Vincent family of Surrey. And it was ratified, I think, at the Herald's visitation of 1620 of the county. But at the time that he died and erected his tomb, he wasn't. But he didn't worry about that. This was North Hill, my handsome. This was pretty remote. And so therefore, you know, you weren't going to get a herald or somebody moaning about him displaying it illegally. So not only was this a status symbol, but it was also in North Hill a status symbol to rival those of the Spore family, who colonised the south aisle of North Hill Church with a whole range of their own monuments and so on. So he plonked this at the east end of the north aisle as a rival or a balance, if you like, whatever the case. But that's what he did. That's what he wanted. He lived in the manner of Battens. The Spores lived in the manner of Trebartha, sorry. And you know, there is this sort of innate, if you like, parochial rivalry symbolised by slate tombs. Now, fecundity was also important, because there's no point just in putting a monument up to yourself and your missus. You really wanted to make sure that the beholder, the audience, the onlooker, realized that you were really quite fecund, that you had an awful lot of family. You were successful. Success was measured, obviously, in those times in family size to a certain extent. And so Thomas Vincent was not shy at all of discoursing how many children he had. The iconography otherwise is really quite unusual. You've got this figure of an angel trampling death in its coffin there. You've got the serpent over there, and then lower down you've got the figure of death, again with the serpent wrapped around his staff, and the figure of death is pointing the arrow at poor old Thomas Vincent there with the scythe. And then on top of the tomb chest, you have this beautifully inscribed inscription. Look at the H of Here Lieth, and the B for bodies, and T for Thomas, and V for Vincent, and so on. Beautifully incised with cherubs and all sorts of other sort of Renaissance-inspired flummery. But a beautifully incised slab, but made of slate. Here's another one at St. Briac, 2 effigies set in a strapwork frame. You've got a whole panel of heraldry up here and below, and a very, very complex achievement right up at the top. So again, these people were intent on broadcasting, on discoursing how well connected, how well related they were in the county. Here's another one at Polint, the tomb chest of Francis Buller and his wife and family. Again, got family. Look at the number of kids there. Horrendous, isn't it? And in case you were not sure of the meaning of the heraldry, then often you had inscriptions to blazon it for you, to describe it for you. And so, you know, there was no mistaking how well connected these people aspired to be. Here's another one, St. Stephen's by Saltash. You've got 2 effigies up there in a strapwork frame held by these individuals. You've got the family underneath in slate. Somebody's had a go at this in painting it and so on, but I think originally the degree of polychromy was probably just restrained to the heraldry. Now, facing this, or just at an angle in St. Stephen's by Saltash, is this monument to Margaret Honeywood of 1625. Now, these were large 3-dimensional structures, rather at odds with the modest Cornish manufactured slates with their tiny cartoon-like effigies, if you like, and you know, an array of family, lots of heraldry, you know, all sorts of things going on. These were much more different. The iconography is strongly didactic. You've got these large, somberly attired principal figures. Here's Margaret Honeywood in all her glory, deeply authoritative and oozing status just by their sort of size and how they look. Look at the rigidity of the figure drawing, how the folds of the dress aren't really natural at all. Here she is propped up on her elbow with it almost looks like an armed breastplate, but presumably with some kind of rigid stomacher. And look at the Botox face here. You've got no sympathy there. You've got no humanity. It's just a smooth, almost like a death mask, with her hair sort of pulled back and this great long veil that most unnaturally just is in these straight folds folding towards her feet. So there's no sympathy with natural draperies or behavior, how these things were actually, you know, represented to life. And the identity, if you like, projected by these tombs was that of a select superior community who were culturally, financially, religiously superior to these people, these Cornish middling sort, if you like, who put up their own Cornish tombs of slate. And they aspired to be English, I think, rather than Cornish. And they were adherents very much of a kind of cliquey Plymouth Puritanism, rather than, if you like, a more tolerant Cornish, you know, hail fellow well met, you know, let sleeping dogs lie kind of attitude to Protestantism and so on. So you've got this sort of slate slabs on the one hand, and you've got these rather austere, strict. You can just imagine this lady being an abject Puritan, can't you? Made of beerstone and so on. So again, originating from southwest Devon. Here's another one at Launcesles to John Chammond, died 1624. You've got the virtues above, very important, obviously, in Puritan iconography. You've got a range of shields along this entablature. You've got an achievement on top. You've got slate panels with inscriptions and all sorts of things. And you've got this rigidly reclining figure in armor. How one reclines like that in armor, I don't know, but he did. And in his hand, he holds his scroll, a document, if you like, because to either side of him, kneeling at head and foot, were his heirs. He didn't have any family. He was the last of his line. So not only did he take this opportunity to erect this massive, impressive monument commemorating him and the last of his line, but he made sure that his heirs, who were his steward, Edward Arundel, and his nephew, Richard Porter, were at top and bottom of the effigy, kneeling in humble supplication towards, not towards God, if you like, but towards him, because that was the scroll with all the landed authority in his hands that he was due to divest to them. So you've got this change, as I say, from humble Cornishness, if you like, status symbol, parochial rivalry, etc., to somebody who is almost holier than thou, and holier, if you like, than God to a certain extent. Just think of the tombs in Exeter Lady Chapel to Dorothea Doddridge and her husband John Doddridge, who are cast in the same sort of mould. There are others in Cornwall. This is at Lezant to Mary, the wife of Robert Rashley, 1621. This is at St Michael Pencavel to Boscowans, around about 1626. And this amazing double-decker kind of structure is at Mevagissey to Otwell Hill. And again, look at Mrs. Hill, for want of a better word. She almost looks like she's doing sort of elbow press-ups here, most uncomfortable. And look at the severity of this stomacher and the lack of naturalism of the folds of the drapery. His coat, you know, it never have folded like that. But this is the strictness, if you like, with which these people wish to be remembered, wish to be appear like this on their tomb. And I made this in my thesis. You can tell it's for a doctoral thesis because at the bottom it says schematic diagram. So it wasn't just a diagram, it was a schematic diagram. I mean, why use one word when two will do in a PhD thesis? I mean, that's the general sort of kind of construct. But it just drew together the relationships and interrelationships of some of these families who were commemorated with these Southwest Devon tombs. Honeywood there, Buller, the Moyles, Prideaux, Corritons at St Melian, Rashleys at Foy, Trefusis, Flushing, Boscawen, obviously, in St Michael Pencavel, the Rouses at St Dominic, Robarts in Truro, and so on. So all interrelated into this kind of Puritan clique society. Now, not all like this. This was a modest monument. It's a wall monument. It's not very big. It looks bigger than it actually is. At Minster to John Hender and his wife. This was made from alabaster quarried in Somerset, watchets and decuments. The stone taken by sea to Barnstaple, and then this monument sculpted in Barnstaple and then transported further down the coast. And as you can see, there's a sharp contrast both in materials and the iconography and the appearance of these things. These were the social peers of these Puritan gentry, but they were religiously divergent. You've got small family groups or individuals kneeling modestly under rounded arches. And their conceptualization didn't really compare to these sort of massive, austere figures like John. Sorry if you can hear the wind, it is blowing a hoolie here at the moment. To John Chammond at Launceston or Margaret Honeywood at St Stephen's by Saltash. You've got these much more modest figures in frames, no allegorical analogies, and these families clung to a kind of religious traditionalism. They were Anglican, they were Protestant, obviously, but they supported a kind of Arminian style of Anglicanism favoured by the king. So although these families were grand and armigerous and of status and so on, and they were as much interrelated, just like the Southwest Devon lot were, by politics and marriage, these were more Arminian and more royalist, if you like, than the other group, which tended towards a parliamentary Puritan aspect. And this group similarly identified themselves with a monument type specific, if you like, to their socioeconomic grouping. Here's another one at Minster to William Cotton. Here's one at Budog to Sir John Killigrew and his wife Mary. And at Crowan, we've got one to Thomas St Aubyn, 1652, who was actually a royalist in a very pro-parliamentary family. And as we shall see, this monument actually stuck out like a sore thumb in Crowan Church, simply because he wanted to discourse the fact that he was different from the rest of the family and he did that using a commemorative artifact for himself. So just like the Southwest Devon tomb, this again is a sort of construct, schematic diagram again of the interrelationships of these monumental patrons. You've got the Wadden Wyndhams down in the bottom right-hand corner. They were the owners of the quarries up in Somerset. You've got links there with Harris, Cotton in Hender and Eastbrook at Minster, Moons in the middle, Killigrew's off to Arweneck in Budok, and so on and so on and so on. So again, smaller network, more remote, but still very intent on discoursing themselves as being different by a particular kind of monumental style. Now I mentioned Crowan and how the monument to Thomas St Albin sticks out like a sore thumb, still does to a certain extent in the church, because the St Albans at Crowan, all they did was patronise brasses. And unfortunately, these illustrations are taken from Polwheal, because if you go to Crown Church today, you won't see anything like this. The brasses now are a bit of a wreck of what was once there, courtesy of James Pearce St Albin, unfortunately, who removed them all from their slabs, took them all to Clowns for safekeeping, end of quotes, and then returned them in pieces to the church. But this is how they were in Polwheal's day at the start of the 19th century. So you've got Geoffrey St Albin, Kirk of 1420. You've got another Geoffrey St Albin, 1490. You've got Thomas St Albin, 1512. You've got another Thomas St Albin, 1562. John St Albin of 1590. And lo and behold, you've got another John St Albin of 1626. And you can see that they are the same old, yada, yada, yada. You've got two effigies, you've got groups of children, you've got shields, you've got a marginal inscription around them. That's what they wanted, that's what they got, no imagination at all. And these things were plastered on the floor of Crowan Church, where Polwheal fortunately drew them. And as you can see, here they are, carpeting the floor of the chancel there, with the St Albin pew plonked straight on top of quite a lot of them. And there, just there in the background, you see sticking out like the sore thumb, the monument to Thomas St Albin, 1652. So he wasn't going to have a brass for himself. He wasn't going to be associated with the rest of his family being commemorated in the chancel. He wanted something markedly distinctive for himself, and that's what he got. Now, the Arundels also manipulated brasses, and I say manipulated because they used them as tools. Now, prior to the Reformation, the Arundels commemorated themselves chiefly at St Column. They had some brasses there. Unfortunately, the vast majority have gone. Some were damaged in the gunpowder explosion that happened there. And post Reformation, they tended to focus much more in the privacy of Lanherne and the church next door, St Morgan in Pida. And they used it, if you like, pretty much as a Catholic church. They were heavily fined for their recusancy, but they were there amongst, if you like, their friends, their religious friends at St Morgan. And so they patronized London brasses heavily. And laid down about 9 or 10 from about 1560 onwards. And it's not the fact that they have effigies and inscriptions and so on. It's the fact that they did carpet the church floor in these brasses, because they were again using brasses almost like a kind of self-righteous justification for themselves. They were buried there. They were still discoursing a degree of grandiose status seeking in society. You know, okay, they were recusants, they were taxed out of existence, but they were still there. They were still the Arundels. They still could hold their heads up high in St Morgan, and they used brasses as a tool in the rest of the village community to display that. And brasses were important because they found a brass engraver in London, again these are all London products, who would actually include the illegal intercessory requests on the inscriptions for them. In other words, they still believed in intercession. Protestants and the London workmen probably didn't. But the brass of George Arundel, 1573, had "On whose soul God have mercy." And there are others in this great ensemble of brasses that show exactly the same. So you've got the Arundels using a brass as a specific tool here, raison d'etre, if you like, and they did it magnificently and in large numbers. So let's just backtrack a little bit. Here's a slate monument at Blisland, typical slate monument. It was to one of the Kemp family, Humphrey Kemp and his family, 1624. The Kemps had moved to Levethan in Blisland, which again is a remote parish on the top of the moor, around about 1500. And they weren't previously memorialised, but here they were in slate. And so you have Humphrey there, kneeling opposite his wife, who unfortunately was died. You can see the skull there denoting that. And they are in their Sunday best, and he has a son who is in armour. So he is proud to suggest that his son was in military service. And behind his wife, he's got two daughters. Again, they're in nicely embellished, again, Sunday best with embroidered sort of petticoats and so on. And lots of words, lots of text, if you like, just to sort of justify their appearance on this tomb and their fact that they erected it in the first place. Justifying themselves, Cornish family, using Cornish materials, using Cornish workmanship. This is what you got. Naive, but to them, more than adequate, more than satisfactory. This, on the other hand, was what you got if you were a Puritan. This was St Anthony and Ambrose Rouse at St Dominic on their massive tomb in the church there. You can see there is one pillar left on the right-hand side. There would have been another 5 supporting a large tester on top. And these figures, again, look at them. They're not praying. They're quite replete, just as if they've had a good lunch, with their hands clasped over their stomachs, if you like. Quite self-satisfied, quite content with their lot, and you know, very, very sort of conscious, if you like, of their own dignity. We are the business. Look up to us. We are, you know, we are superior to you. And at St Dominic, St Anthony House appointed the Reverend Charles Fitzgerald. He was an author of some quite, what's the right word, vibrant funeral sermons, which clearly extolled the Puritan virtues of the deceased when he preached them on their death. And certainly for Sir Anthony Rouse, late of Halton in Cornwall Knight, the sermon was published in London in 1622. The subject was Elisha, his lamentation for his own and all Israel's loss. The subject of a sermon preached at the funerals of the right worshipful Sir Anthony Rouse. I've had a look at it, an easy read, it ain't. If you are an insomniac, get hold of a copy of it and you will have no trouble in nodding off. And a Barnstaple product of Somerset alabaster. Look at that, it's beautiful, isn't it? You've got a humble kneeling figure. Again, this isn't a large structure. It's only about 3 foot high. A beautiful kneeling figure, quite modest, set under a close round arch. You've got some pillars with some Corinthian capitals on the top, and you've got a short, small apron. But this is not a depth. This monument has no depth. It really is a wall monument. It's not a standing monument or anything like that. It's quite a modest thing, as I say, to Penelope Drew at Bucconnock. So again, prior to the Reformation, let's just sort of connect a few ends. We've got connectivity rather than monumental materiality. And you've got cataclysm stone, maybe, as I say, who knows, used as an expression of sanctity. But after the Reformation, you've got slate as this indigenous Cornish material of the material for the middling sort who've never really had the opportunity to be commemorated before. You've got beer stone used by Protestants, Puritans, politicians. And I put payday loan sharks because I was searching for another word beginning with P, wanting to look at Robarts, who was a well-known usurer with his magnificent tomb in Truro Cathedral now. So payday loan sharks and parliamentarians. And then you've got Somerset Marble, Barnstaple manufacturer, again to Protestants, but these are Arminians and royalists, not with the hardness of the Puritan cliquey, so if you like, personified on their tomb and in their funeral sermons by the Rouses down in St Dominic. Now, people will be wondering, well, this is a Devon and Cornwall Record Society. What are we doing about records? And my answer to that is, well, these are the records. These are the very documents. These are primary sources. And if I'm ever asked to choose a favourite, then it has to be this one at St Tudi to Alice Ruskemmer around about 1570, because she was a widow and she had 4 daughters to marry off. So immediately you've got sort of shades of Pride and Prejudice, really. And she did very well. Okay, she was helped because one daughter died early, so it was of no longer of concern. Few, so only 3 left. And so this first daughter here, married first time, first husband dies, and then she actually had the successful ability to marry again. So job done. Second daughter married, tick. Third daughter married, tick. All done. What a successful career she had in re-establishing what was otherwise going to be the end of her family. And you can see what a matriarchal figure she is. Not only is she bigger than her daughters, she would be, wouldn't she? But look at her dress. Look at this beautiful embroidered representation here. She's got a lovely rough French bonnet here, her hands at prayer quite modestly. But look at the difference between her and her daughters. Okay, they've got frilly underskirts and so on, but their dresses are plain. They've got smaller ruffs, and you know, their Paris caps are bigger, and so on. But you know, it is a glorious representation, I think, of a female agency of actually working here in this way. And again, look at how the slate shines over their faces. Because people have touched them. You automatically touch their faces, and hands of these people. You're trying to get a contact of them. And for people that really want some kind of documentation, you know, these are just images. Where are the words? Well, these are the words. This is a panel that was originally on her tomb. And it reads, her birth, her race, her lineage and descent, how well she lived, how happy she did die. These scutcheons blaze, these images present, these tables teach, this hearse doth testify to all grave matrons which survive, set forth both to admire and imitate her worth. So what it's saying really is how these scutcheons, in other words, the shields with the heraldry, and these images present, in other words, the images of the matriarchal mother and her 3 daughters, how they present her birth, in other words, there she was, her race in the heraldry, her lineage and descent, again in the heraldry, how well she lived. In other words, there she was in all her Sunday best, in her magnificent, best possible embroidered skirt, and how happy she did die because her family was sorted. These tables teach, in other words, these inscriptions actually tell you how it is. This hearse doth testify. Hearse is an old English word for a tomb. So this tomb does testify to all grave matrons which survive, set forth, get on, as they say in Cornwall, both to admire and to imitate her worth. In other words, admired what she'd done, imitate her worth, be like her, do your job, and live well and die happily. There you go. I think that's about enough for now. So I will stop sharing my screen. I hope you've enjoyed it, and any questions I will be very pleased to answer.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Paul. That was tremendous. I could hear that all over again, to be perfectly honest. Informative, but actually interesting, well delivered. I remember in the university, in the history department, I was taken aside by a senior member of staff and said, remember, you only have to inform them. You don't have to be interesting. Said the man that had very few students. I remember thinking at the time, thinking, yes, I think you must do that on purpose. But that was absolutely great. Now, are there any questions? There's a question on chat I can see. Can you see the chat question, Paul?
Yeah, hang on. Looking at the Callington Monument, there seems to be a significant amount of graffiti incised. Yeah. Are there examples on Cornish tombs which are likely to have been put there for apotropaic purposes? Not as far as I know. And I think the thing about alabaster is that it is a beautiful medium for actually putting, actually writing your initials on. It's everybody does it, and you look at alabaster effigies all over the place. The other effigies in similar, in harder stones, and certainly none of them in slate seem to have initials on, or any kind of apotropaic meaning. So I think it's just, again, the medium there, but I'm not sure. I'm just hypothesizing.
There's a question from Stuart. Unmute.
Yeah, sorry, it took a moment. Yes, alabaster, of course, is amongst the softest of stones. It's on the Mohs scale. It's one of the. It's towards. Is it 2 or 3 or something? It's very very soft and easily done. I had a question about the Carmino effigies at St Morgan in Menague. Is that? Do you know what stone they are?
No. No, they're not terribly well preserved, unfortunately. They were in the open air, I think, for quite a long time in the 18th century before they were brought into the church. They were in a chapel at Carmino, yeah, they're pretty degraded. I think it would be lovely to chip off a bit of you know, the stone to find out. Indeed, but I'm loath to do that, obviously, officially anyway.
I don't want to monopolise things, but the other thing, my other comment was about the depressed 4-centred arches that you described at Centendelium, and there is a very good precedent for those in the early 14th century at in the Pulpitum at Exeter.
Okay,
which Thomas Whitney played around with all sorts of designs both the Pulpitum in particular and the choir furnishings in general, which he later used at the Lady Chapel at Wells and the Rectory Choir and places that he worked later on a larger scale. But when the Dean and Chapter were considering removing the Pulpitum in the 19th century, the architectural historians of the day couldn't believe that it was early 14th century because of the wide 4-centred arches. So they represent one of the things that Thomas Whitney was playing around with at that very early date.
Okay, that's interesting. Good comment. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, the Barnstable bit pricked my ears up a bit. It when you go around to some of the churches around Barnstable, they have those roundels with alabaster, which are often meant to suggest something biblical, you know, a hand cutting down the wheat or light coming from heaven. Is that replicated in Cornwall as well?
No, not generally. No. It does seem to be quite a sort of Devonian Barnstable thing. Just again using Somerset alabaster because it was easily carvable. It was nice to look at, you know, multi-veined, multicolored kind of appearance, and very soft, so malleable and easy to sculpt. But no, I don't think those sorts of things didn't seem to transfer across the border. No.
I mean, that's kind of curious, isn't it? Because,
well, again, Barnstable had a lot of Puritanism in it, didn't it?
Yeah.
You know, and again, that smacks more of that kind of thing rather than these people who use the same carvers, but if you like, modulated the iconography to something more gentle.
All right. We have a comment from 675612.
Okay, Joe Mattingly here. Just to say, I like it. I like the idea of saintly Thomas Vivian, who I don't think Bodmin thought was particularly saintly. There are lots of court cases between him and the town. But I think you could also see that parallel with alabaster, where alabaster was being used early on from the 14th century on for altars, reredos, probably figures in rude lofts, all those sorts of things. And I also wonder a little bit, it's, you know, both take a polish, they're a bit like marble, they're quality products from limited sources. So there's a rarity value. But I do wonder if there were more tombs of cataclys. I mean, you know, and certainly shrines. I think there were certainly more shrines. Was the north, and I checked to see if there were any in Devon, but the one I thought might have been cataclys wasn't. But you know, certainly it may say more about the, and also I think you've looked at whether there are parallels with the marble tombs of Henry VII in London. You know, so it's a local material that imitates, and it's rare, and you know, I'm a very powerful prior of Bodmin.
Exactly. Just so, you know, look at me. I am it, basically. And going back to alabaster, certainly it was not uncommon in freestone effigies to have the face cut away and an insert of alabaster used simply for the facial features, because it has this translucency which they valued as an aesthetic quality. So that, you know, it was just the face that was of alabaster and the rest was painted or whatever it was. So again, you've got this kind of materialism between, as you said, retables of alabaster, the little alabaster panels that were made and exported throughout the continent, all that kind of thing. So yeah, I think there is a sort of sanctity of materiality to do with alabaster as well. Yeah.
Is there anyone else? Like, a lot of people have turned off their cameras, so we can't see those. So you'd have to put your questions in for chat then. Stuart.
Yeah, it's just one more thing that came to mind. Do you have any idea where the workshops for the slate memorials were?
You can read my thesis.
I'd love to. Yes, send me one.
I can certainly send you the PDF of it.
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah.
I don't cover them all there, but I make some hypotheses about where they might have been.
Like Todd, I'd seen a copy of the BAR at a price that I was not prepared to pay.
No.
I think it was 90, so a little bit less than 110. Still, it's a silly price.
No, very, very happy to send you a PDF with the whole thing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
In Barnstaple, no, in Tavistock, about 30 years ago, they were cleaning out one of the Boucher tombs and they found a tool, which they think a workman had left behind. It was a little trowel, which was inside the tomb. Which I always thought was rather amusing, you know, workmen afterwards saying, "Now, where did I put that down?" It was, I'm sure I brought it with me. And I was wondering at the time how early it was, but also where they got their designs from, because presumably that might have been made by a local blacksmith for them. With the earlier tools altogether, how do you think designs of such tools got around? You know, I mean, were workmen, do you think, making up special tools for carving in slate?
I don't think so, because I've chatted to carvers. There are some local to where I live in Wendron, and explained to them what I was researching, and they just said, well, you know, these are the sorts of chisels we use for these sorts of stone. These are what we use for wood. And they are the same now as they probably were 100 years ago. You know, why bother? You know, I mean, sculpture is sculpture. You know, you're hacking away bits of stone with a chisel and a mallet, and you know, it doesn't really change very much. What I did, one of my great interests is in monuments in France, in incised slabs in France, and there you get wide lines. Sometimes probably something like, what, half an inch, centimetre wide, quite deep. And I took him some photos of those, and he said, well, yes, you would need a special adapted chisel to do that, because without it, you'd get, with it, you wouldn't have the sharp edges that you've got in the lines of that particular thing. And doing what's called taille d'épargne, in other words, a particular kind of sculpture where you cut away a lot of the surface, leaving the lines in relief, if you like, so that instead of the lines being incised, it's the background that's incised away. Again, you would need wide splayed chisels to do that, and he said those would probably be specially adapted. But just for your normal sculptural work, it's what he was using then in his studio.
Right. That's interesting. I think they've kept the tool at Tavistock. I think it may be in the chest.
Yeah.
There's another church in Devon which has found, the church orders have found some early woodworking tools. And I haven't seen them yet. I've just seen photographs of them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think John Allen told me that when he was in France, their tools there were different from the tools that we were using here at the time.
Yeah.
And you know, you just wonder, workmen going around and saying, "Oh, that's nice," and trying to work out if they can copy that kind of tool, if it's better than what they were having. You know, just it's bothered me.
I don't know. I think again, you can fly kites here, can't you?
Yeah.
I mean, certainly workmen travelled. We know that. And you know, between countries, I mean, Breton workmen were working in Cornwall. And you know, certainly in France, we were getting people coming from Paris to work in the Pays de la Loire. So you know, they were bringing cosmopolitan influences with them in design. So yeah, workmen travelled and presumably took their tools with them.
And some of your not to be rude, but some of your heads and your faces were a little less accomplished than some of the others.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, some of them I thought, oh, that's what I would do, you know, kind of pumpkin heads and sort of cardboard box bodies. I mean, I looked at them, I thought, crumbs, that's really not great. But others were really superior. Do you think it could be the tools or just the skills of the workmen?
The latter.
Yeah.
The latter. I mean, particularly in something like slate, you know, which you can pretty much carve with a penknife. So you know, it is. I think that's purely down to drawing and the skill of the sculptor. Yeah.
And what about the use of paint? Some of it seems a little enthusiastic.
I think some of the two of the ones that I showed you at Polint and St Brieuc, I think somebody has got a Christmas present of Humbrol paints and gone up there and painted the effigies in nice shining silver armor and all that kind of thing. I found no evidence of polychromy on the slates themselves other than the heraldry, which is as you might expect, but not really on the effigies or the, you know, the children, or even on the decoration. So I think it wasn't widespread, no, which again makes them more Cornish. You know, this is the slate. This was the indigenous material.
Well, now, is there anybody else has a question? Sorry, I've been asking one after another. Right, well, it looks like we're going to hold it to that, Paul.
Good, great.
Now, I've had 2 messages coming on email from people saying how much they've enjoyed it already. So
good.
Yeah.
I think they'll, like me, think it's absolutely tremendous, and greatly appreciate you giving up your afternoon for us. I'm not sure where you're living. Are you in France?
Not at the moment. No, I'm in Nanny Goat Land in Cornwall, basically, on the Granite Ridge. So not far from Wendron.
Right. Okay. Well, that's reasonable.
But I'm off to France on Monday.
All right. Well, thank you for giving up your afternoon. I've had a tremendous afternoon. I'm sure others have as well. And I think the sun's coming out in praise as well, because it's been a rocky morning here, hasn't it? So thank you very much. And from everybody, if we could show our appreciation, little hands or whatever. And look forward to Paul's book in a year's time, which will be on Cornish churches and notes by Mr. Glynn and what he says about Cornwall, which is just tremendous. And thank you all for coming in. On the 4th of December is Martin Grabe on folk songs in Devon. And then the 11th of December, Peter Monda on Devon Serge, the whole cloth industry he's going to unveil, which will be tremendous as well. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.